Welcome to another episode of Behavior Grooves. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. Kurt, I heard you were up late last night reading a book about the value of work.
Okay, Tim, do you have a video camera in my bedroom? This is crazy, and it's kind of scary, too.
No.
Yes, it was late, but it wasn't just any book about work. It was Is Your Job Worth It by Christopher Michaelson and Jennifer Toasty Karras.
It sounds like a fantastic question to pose in the form of a book, right? Did it keep you up past your bedtime, by the way?
Well, you should know you saw the video. So yes,
No.
Okay, I like reading books by our guests, actually. We read our books by our guests. And in all seriousness,
Yes.
It was a fascinating read. And it got me thinking about the nature of work and how we define success. And now I know that sounds a bit philosophical, which is more in your character and a little bit of out of character for me. But it got me thinking about, why do we work?
Well, lucky for us, today, our guest will actually help us dive deeper into that topic, because today we're going to welcome Christopher Michaelson, one of the co-authors of Is Your Job Worth It?
That's right, Tim. And Christopher is a professor of ethics and business law at the University of St. Thomas Opus College of Business right here in the Twin Cities. He is also an adjunct professor of medical ethics at the University of Minnesota Medical School.
Another classic underachiever.
Yeah, we have lots of those. Yeah.
Yes. Christopher is half of the team that wrote this compelling book on how to think about work. He's the philosophical side. And as you might imagine, we were grateful to chat with him about both of their work and to get that philosophical perspective from him.
Yeah. And Tim, he's also quite the musical lover, which I know you might have appreciated.
Oh, yeah, totally love that part of the conversation. And speaking of which, I should mention that we're going to have a conversation with his co-author, Jennifer Toasty Karras, on a separate episode. And that conversation is even more about music. We might be swapping some playlist recommendations with her even.
You and your music. Yeah. But yes, Christopher and Jennifer share some intriguing musical insights, both with us, but also in their book. And more importantly, our conversation with Christopher asks some very important questions about the nature of how we think about our work. For example, we'll be diving into the different orientations people have towards their work. So they divide them into three primary categories. At least this is the way that Christopher and Jennifer talk about it: job, career, and calling. And we'll discuss how the stories of 9/11 victims shed some light on the meaning of work in our lives.
It sounds fantastic.
Yeah, and we'll also be talking about redefining success and the potential downsides of viewing work as a calling, which, we don't normally think of. We think of calling as a good thing, but, Christopher talks about maybe not so much.
The downsides of work as a calling.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sounds like fascinating stuff. I also hear that Christopher has some very personal stories that bring these concepts to life in a really vivid way.
Absolutely. I mean, he shares some moving accounts of his grandfather's journey from China to Brazil to the United States, which offers a unique perspective on work and success across generations and across cultures.
I can't wait to hear more about this. And of course, we're going to wrap up with our signature desert island music question.
Yeah, you and your desert island scenarios, Mr. Houlihan. But I have to admit, I was surprised when I heard Christopher's picks.
Me too. I agree with you there. Okay, so now we urge you to sit back and relax with a sparkling pour of Find Your Calling or Not, and enjoy our conversation with Christopher Michaelson. Christopher Wong Michaelson, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
It's our pleasure to have you here, and we're going to start with a fantastic speed round question. Do you prefer Coke or Pepsi?
I was hoping you would ask me that question. So I have a story behind this. Back in my consulting days, I think I can speak a little bit about it, but not too much detail. One of my clients was Pepsi.
Oh.
And I quickly learned that Pepsi regarded itself as blue and Coke was red. Nothing to do with American political parties or anything, but, just the branding of the products. And I heard stories about if you wore red on the PepsiCo corporate campus, you would get kicked out. You'd get berated by certain people who were really
Wow.
brand conscious. So the fact is, I worked with them for years, and I always have preferred Coke, but they had Pepsi machines there,
Yeah.
and I just had to sort of bleed Pepsi while I was there. I did have colleagues who worked for Coke, and we weren't allowed to talk about each other's clients because, of course, there are lots of corporate secrets. But we did talk enough that I got the impression that if you wore blue at Coca-Cola headquarters, then that would be trouble for you too.
I was at Coca-Cola headquarters just a few months ago now, and nobody wears blue. There's just no blue. In fact, the amount of branding overwhelmed me. It wasn't just people wear red or pink, or like they wear Coca-Cola brand stuff, shoes, socks, slacks, skirts, dresses, shirts, hats. It blew me away.
If you want to know how to create enthusiasm for a product, I mean, those are great case studies to look to. I heard a story about a guy who, remember back in the day when an Apple laptop, you could like get a color wrapper on it, kind of like with an iPhone. And somebody happened to have a red Apple laptop, and they were told never bring that laptop back to our campus.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Tim, I'm just glad in all of those articles of clothing that you mentioned, you did not mention underwear, because I'd be very concerned about how far you were going to check the branding of these people. So, all right. Speed round question. So, if you could have a superpower for an hour, what would that be?
Oh, I wasn't prepared for that one.
I know we shake it up.
We change them up.
There are so many possible superpowers. I mean, so I can think of it. It just seems like it would be so fun to be able to fly, but I don't know if that would be a good choice, because that doesn't really enable you to do much except for have a little bit of fun. It would also be nice to be able to read people's minds, or maybe it wouldn't be so nice to read people's minds, depending upon what they're thinking about you.
Right.
So I guess those are the first two that come to mind. I would also love to say, I mean, this is getting a little heavy, but the ability to live forever is a superpower that I think a lot of people aspire to. But then, as a philosopher, I think part of the preciousness of life is that it doesn't last forever. So, wow, you took me to a deep place very quickly.
That's a place that I am happy to go to for a good long conversation.
We just interviewed Jody Wellman, who wrote a book, You Only Die Once, talking about this idea that, death actually lends itself to us living life being more precious, and various different pieces of that. And so there is that aspect, I think, very much so, that living forever, it sounds wonderful on the upfront, but man, that could be actually very horrible, if you ask me. So
yeah, and you're reminding me that in our book we talk about some stories of people for whom their death story is very much part of their life story. Socrates and Joan of Arc in particular, and that sort of suggests that we don't have to look at death as the antithesis or, end of life, even though, in some ways it is, but it really is part of the story.
Love that. I love that thought. I'm so looking forward to the rest of our conversation together. I'm already just kind of tingly with excitement.
Let's just do speed round the whole time. This is fun.
Yeah. Maybe we should.
We need to rename our speed round. I think it's, it's the sometimes speedy, most often really long and really fun round. Here we go.
Oh. Okay, third question for speed round. Agree or disagree with what David Bowie had to say when he said, always remember that the reason that you initially started working was that there was something inside yourself that you felt that if you could manifest it in some way, you would understand more about yourself and how to coexist with the rest of society.
Well, we wouldn't have put that in the book if we didn't think that there was something to it. And I agree with it for David Bowie. I agree with it for myself. And I think I would like to agree with it for most people, but I think in some way we have oftentimes in our society just a less healthy, less optimistic outlook toward the burdens of work. And so that becomes unfortunate. But, work is our way of contributing to a society and to being part of a community.
Yeah, and fantastic. And I'm sure we'll get into that more. Last of our speed round questions. What's the difference between a shit job and a bullshit job?
So we have to give all credit to David Graeber, who coined the term bullshit jobs. And bullshit jobs are essentially jobs that, if they ceased to exist, they wouldn't make any difference in the world. And those jobs are plentiful, especially in bureaucracies. So if you read, I don't know, Russian literature, Nikolai Gogol, there's this story called The Overcoat, and there's this guy who's just a copyist, and he's just copying letters, and he's treated poorly by all his coworkers, and there are all these positions in this bureaucratic hierarchy that are just ministerial. Those are bullshit jobs. Shit jobs are often necessary. Even, we sometimes learned this term during the pandemic, essential, and yet they might be gross, they might be dirty, they might be undignified, and oftentimes they're poorly paid and poorly treated. But that doesn't mean that they don't matter.
Yeah.
In fact, Jen and I, we actually wrote a second book at the same time that we were writing this book because we had a contract with an academic publisher. And that book actually starts out with a whole reflection on the toilet paper shortage during the pandemic, and just the ways in which toilet paper production became, for a time, heroic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man. So many avenues to go. Let's get into the book that we're here to talk about, though. Is your work worth it? How to think about meaningful work. A book that you and Jennifer Toscaris co-authored. Unfortunately, she couldn't join us today, and we regret that. But we are happy to have this conversation with you. So to get started, maybe let's just set sort of a level set here, Christopher. What is the nature of work? Why do we do it?
Oh, that's a huge question. And one thing I'm going to say, you mentioned that Jen is not here today. She's the social scientist. I'm the philosopher. She's a woman. I'm a man. She's reminds me often that she's 10 years younger than I am. And so this is very much a team effort, the writing of this book, because we wanted to bring these diverse perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we also have diverse perspectives on what is work and why do we do it. One of the core theories that we explore in this book is a theory that has been especially popularized is the wrong word, but it's the word that comes to mind. And basically, it's the idea that there are three work orientations that are prevalent, especially among maybe Americans, but I think now enough study has been done to say these kind of resonate with people around the world. And those three work orientations are job, career, and calling. And they're called work orientations because they have to do with how people relate to their work, but they also help to answer the question, why do some people work? A job is a means to the end of material wealth or just sustenance, so making money. A career is a means to the end of advancement, and a calling is an end in itself, usually a socially valuable end or a personally fulfilling end. And once you think about that theory, Jen actually writes in the book, when she learned it as a graduate student, she could no longer unsee those categories. They were just such a powerful way of looking at why we work. And people, when they learn about this, they immediately categorize themselves. And that's part of the power of the theory and part of the benefit of the theory. I think that's really important. But at the same time, I think if we restrict ourselves to those 3 reasons to work, we miss out on a lot of other reasons that people work, or maybe we miss out on the nuances within job, career, and calling. So I hope that the listeners are now thinking, well, why else might I work other than those reasons? Something that might come immediately to mind is just to alleviate boredom. So one question that we explore in the book is, what would you do with your life if you didn't work? And we're quite convinced that even though a lot of people, especially people who are talking about the end of work because technology is going to take over everybody's jobs, we're going to get a universal basic income and we're all going to spend time at the beach, we think that people might get bored in that kind of world. People might feel creatively frustrated in that kind of world where there was no work. So anyway, alleviation of boredom might be another reason to work. Another reason we work is reflected in that David Bowie quote, to relate to the society around us, to contribute, and to experience camaraderie. And that's something that we discovered in our research that actually is the initial research that brought Jen and me together as a research team. We were looking at the work of 9/11 victims and how their families viewed the place of work in lives that more often than not were taken in the workplace.
Yeah. So let me dig into that 9/11, because I think it's a really big part of the book and various different pieces of it. So how do the stories of the victims of 9/11, what do they teach us about this, and what did you learn from those stories?
Yeah, there are a lot of stories that we tell in the book, including those of 9/11 victims. And, we even draw on the famous Hamilton song about who lives, who dies, who tells your story.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the tragedies of 9/11 is that people's stories were ended involuntarily, tragically, by terrorists, and they didn't get a chance to tell their final stories or even to finish their stories, so to speak. And at that time, this was not only an unprecedented tragedy, but also the society around us. We were trying to make sense of this loss. And a team of New York Times journalists came together and decided to produce a compendium of what they called portraits of grief, which were 200 to 300 word sort of anecdotal stories that said something about the essential nature of the individual that they were writing about. And in a sense, they wanted to convey the human toll of the attacks. So Jen and I actually were both living and working in New York City around that time. And so we, along with other New Yorkers and people around the world, we were reading these every day in the weeks and months after the attacks and just learning about these people whose lives were uniquely special. And the journalists talked with their close relations, most often, a spouse, a sibling, a parent, a child, even coworkers, to put together these portraits, and ended up just telling beautiful stories about people just like, or maybe not so like, you and me. And they really did accomplish that goal of helping us to recognize that these were real people whose lives were tragically taken. There were also people who, as I mentioned before, were mostly at work on that day. Many of them worked in the World Trade Center. Many of them were first responders, some of them who were even off duty that day, who ran toward danger in order to help others. And those stories didn't tell us how those people in their first person narrative felt about their own work, but they did tell us how their close relations sort of made sense of what made their work worth doing as part of a life worth living.
Yeah, but a sense of purpose. Right?
Exactly. And so work was often that sense of purpose. But interestingly enough, so we ultimately read around 2,400, I think, portraits that were published. There were 2,977 victims, and not all of them were the subjects of portraits, mostly because the journalists couldn't find anybody to talk to. But, that's a pretty big sample of information that we sort of turned into data to study. And one thing that we studied was, were these people remembered as having a job, career, or calling? And even though we did get some really interesting data about that, we also found that in around 2/3 of these portraits, all of which mentioned why the person was at an attack site on that day, and most often the reason was work. Around 2/3 of those portraits really didn't say anything else substantive about work, which suggested that what brought purpose, at least in the stories that were told about these lives, was something away from work. And, that's maybe not so surprising when we think about it. I was just listening to somebody this morning talking about, one thing that hospice patients often regret is having spent too much time at work. And that's an old cliche. Nobody wishes that they had spent more time at work. And that probably was the case in 2/3 of these cases, that work was really just incidental to the purpose in their lives. That said, the other 1/3 suggested that work can be deeply purposeful and part of the meaning and purpose of somebody's life.
I'd like if we could just stay with these three orientations: the job orientation, career orientation, and calling orientation. At least in my worldview, the calling orientation has always had sort of a premium associated with, like, it's always been, it's better if you have a calling. You're better off if you have a calling. It certainly matches the, if you love your work, you never work a day or you love your job, you never work a day in your life. All that kind of bullshit. But the calling has some downsides to it as well. And I was wondering if you could first just help us understand the difference between, or sort of what makes a calling, and then, what are your thoughts about? Is it a good thing? Is it better to have a calling than not have a calling?
Wow, there's so much there. And I want to start by agreeing that do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life is bullshit. As distinguished from a bullshit job, by the way. But
good.
It's just, I think one of the downsides of calling is overwork. Somebody who is so deeply committed to their job might not know when to stop. And that can be a real danger for the rest of one's life. But just to back up a little bit, you said that calling has always sort of had a premium on it. I don't know if that's always the case, or that's always been the case, but it certainly is the case in our current culture. So if you've ever looked at a Google Ngram, it's a way of sort of looking at word usage in print from, I think it's 1870 to 2019 or something like that. You can sort of look at when words came into vogue. So I mentioned essential work earlier. Essential work has 3 peaks. One was during World War I, a small peak. One was during World War II, larger peak. And then the third peak actually isn't even visible on a Google Ngram because the database ends in 2019, but presumably the third peak is the pandemic. With calling, you really see limited usage of the idea of work as a calling until around 2000. And then there's this sort of exponential increase in the discussions about work as a calling. And one seminal moment that Jen often points to in sort of seeding this increase in interest in work as a calling is the famous Steve Jobs Stanford commencement speech in 2005, when he says, I'm going to forget exactly what he says, but he says something like, do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. And something like the only way to do good work is to love your work, I think he really says.
Yeah.
And, that may have been true for Steve Jobs, and it is true for a lot of calling-driven people. I haven't delved deeply into his life, but I do know that he had some detractors, and those people suggested that maybe he was giving too much to work and maybe not giving enough to relationships outside of work. So that's another potential downside of calling. I think what Jen and I really found in our 9/11 research, which of course tracks with this period of time in which calling is sort of ascending to its peak, is that the traditional way of talking about job, career, and calling in that order implies a hierarchy that researchers who study it never actually meant to imply. But the idea is that a job is just a job. That's a phrase that we often use. A career is what it is, and a calling is something to aspire to. And we really found in our 9/11 research that a job can be just as heroic as a calling. It's just that it doesn't get the social esteem, whereas a calling can be just as burdensome as a job, not only because of overwork, but also recent studies suggest that there are some employers who think that it's justified to pay a calling-oriented worker less because they're getting the psychic benefits of enjoying their calling. And so calling can even open somebody to exploitation.
Which there's we could go down many different roads, I think, with that. I think it's really fascinating, though, this idea, as you mentioned, that there isn't implied hierarchy and that one isn't necessarily better for anybody depending upon who they are. And even the downsides you brought up in the book, I'm going to forget the painter's name.
Paul Gauguin?
Yes, there you go. Thank you. And just he left his family and kind of, did all of these other things that were part of his calling, but it led him to be not so great of a person if we were to look at that from an outward perspective as to, what makes a good person. So I find it really fascinating from that perspective. And we need to shift that kind of dialogue, I think, from like a job is not just a job. A job actually has really benefits. And you bring up, and I will mention this, that you and Jen, I love the fact that that you have great titles for your chapters and that all of those titles are questions. And so I'm going to use one of those title questions or one of those chapters as a question back to you, which I think comes into this, right? Is should you work for love or money? Chapter 4, by the way, for our listeners here.
Yeah, I love that you noticed that every chapter is a question. And, I think we live in a society today, I mean, you know this as behavioral scientists, that people are kind of looking to science to give us answers.
Yeah.
And answers matter. Answers are actionable. Answers are important. But I'm a philosopher, and I think philosophers are particularly good at asking questions. And I think the reason that you never hear somebody say, quick, call a philosopher, emergency, is that philosophers might not be great at giving answers. But I think there's sort of a truth to that with important questions, there really are no easy answers. So should you work for love or money? That was a little bit of a teaser to ask an unanswerable question. It depends on a lot of things, but you mentioned Paul Gauguin. So I actually first encountered Paul Gauguin, in an art museum, of course, but then I read about him in the work of philosophers who were studying something called admirable immorality. So just quickly about the story of Paul Gauguin. He was a stockbroker and he was supporting a middle-class family, and he didn't like his work. He always had kind of wanted to be in art. And so, long story short, and a lot of this is legend and it's hard to separate truth from fact, but the legend goes that he abandoned his family, ultimately set sail for the South Seas, and painted all these paintings of people in Tahiti, which, as we record this, the Olympic surfing competition is going on. So,
Yeah.
some of those landscapes are quite familiar from Gauguin paintings.
Mhm.
But anyway, he abandoned his family, never made much money as an artist while he was alive. So he didn't even send back money to support his family in a society in which generally it was difficult for a woman to find work and support the children. So he really failed as a father and a husband, and in that sense was immoral. But should we admire him anyway because he was great at what he did? One of his canvases once broke a record for the highest auction price ever paid for a painting. And of course, his paintings hang in some of the world's most important art museums. Was it worth it? Well, that's a question worth asking. And I think it's difficult to answer, but I think that probably there were better ways of going about doing what he did. He probably could have, scratched that painting itch without leaving his family completely destitute. And so, that's one of those downsides of pursuing a calling. But you're also making me think about, when I say a job can be heroic, what does that mean exactly? One of the New York Times portraits was about a guy named Juan Ortega Campos, who was an immigrant from Mexico who was delivering food in the World Trade Center. And his portrait says that to the suits in the World Trade Center, he might have been, quote, just a delivery boy. But to his family back home, he was a hardworking adventurer who called home every day and sent back money to build a dream. And that suggests that sometimes we don't even look in the eyes of a person who might be doing something heroic for one's family, and that there is dignity in doing honest work that takes care of the people that we love.
I think you also talk in that chapter about this idea of, sometimes you do work to support the stuff that you do outside of work, and that your calling or your passions can be outside of that, and you can live a very fulfilling life and still, have a trudge, shit job, as you said, and be perfectly happy. That's how that works. And I think there's some real interesting pieces. And as you said, I love the idea of looking at somebody in the eye and going, oh, you are just, in our heads, when in fact they are so much more than that. And we don't even ever, do we look past that, what they are doing to the person that they are? And I think that's a big, big kind of thing that we probably could do a better job at.
Absolutely. Yeah. Another feature of modern society is not only to exalt calling, but also to sort of identify people with what they do for work. So, what do you do? Usually is a question about what is your profession? And there's a certain status or lack thereof associated with one's profession. And I think the importance of asking questions rather than imposing universal answers is that there's really no one way to be successful in relation to one's work and one's life. One way to do it that we exalt is to have work that is a calling. But oftentimes people sacrifice money in order to do that. We write a lot about musicians in the book, and there are far more musicians trying to make a living and not able to make ends meet as musicians than there are actual paying musician positions. But another way to structure one's life is to sort of think of work as the way to give me freedom outside of work in order to pursue those things that I love that might not earn an income.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one other thing that I have to mention is that the most prevalent form of poorly paid or usually unpaid work is work inside the home, which historically has been sometimes defined as women's work. And, in a male-dominated history and economy, it's not too surprising, but it is unfortunate that maybe the most important work that is done that has historically fallen onto the shoulders of women, and we saw this again in the pandemic, is not even recognized by tax authorities as work.
Sticking with the musical theme, I mean, why not? I think about how in musical parlances, so it's, at least among amateur musicians, there's this joke that they brought $5,000 worth of gear in a $500 car to a gig that paid them $50. And there's not a lot of hyperbole in that, unfortunately, but a lot of that comes from the fact that they actually have a day job, that they actually have, and another one of my favorite T-shirts was, real musicians have day jobs, because there is the sort of this act of maybe the calling, and you write about the double-edged sword, in the book, but maybe the calling can be an avocation and not the vocation. Does that resonate? Does that fit with the way that you think about these double-edged swords?
Absolutely, it does. And yet I also have to tell a story about a musician who maybe gave us another way of thinking about success. So, when we think about the success of musicians, we think about the ones who actually do succeed in making a living, and usually they are superstars because
Right.
there's very little in between. The economist Robert Frank refers to these kinds of markets where there are a few winners and many more contestants than there are winners as winner-take-all markets.
Yeah.
And so we think success in music or in the performing arts or something are these people that we see in stadiums, on television, on film. I went to Northwestern University in Chicago, which has a really strong theater program. So I had a lot of classmates who were on their way to making it big, and some of them actually made it big. They made it to Broadway, they made it to film, they made it to television.
Yeah, that's
but
cool.
There are many more who didn't make it, who arguably were just as talented.
Mm.
One of them we write about in the book. I reconnected with him after, years of being out of touch, a guy named Dennis Curley, who actually stood next to me in choir freshman year in college. And I always kind of listened to him because I couldn't sight read and I had no musical training. I don't even know how I ended up in choir, but he had perfect pitch. So I thought, I'm just going to stay like a half beat behind and copy him. So I did. And I saw him perform in some shows when we were in college, and, he was amazing. He's kind of self-deprecating, quite modest. And so he would say, well, maybe he wasn't quite as talented as the ones who did make it big. But, to my eyes, and ears, he was just as talented, but he was seeking a job performing in Chicago after graduation, and found that he was really only getting callbacks for being a pianist, which, he was also great at, but he wanted to sing, he wanted to act, he wanted to perform. He didn't just want to sit at the piano. So finally he gave it up. And in contrast to what you were describing, Tim, where, somebody sort of works in order to support an avocation, he just kind of gave up music altogether. He became a paralegal and just did kind of a clerical job that he knew he could do without giving much thought to it because he'd had a clerical job in college and, he made a living. So he kind of bounced from city to city as a paralegal, and maybe the new place, the new firm, that kind of added some variety. But he found that he was often thinking about music while he was performing his mindless job. So he was on a break, actually, in Minneapolis, of all places, between paralegal jobs, and he saw an opportunity to audition for a show. And he thought, well, I'm on vacation, I might as well audition. And he got an offer to be part of the show. And he thought, okay, this is like a decision point in my life. I can make $425 a week with benefits and paid vacation at this law firm that I'm moving to in Philadelphia, or I can make $425 a week with no health insurance, no guarantee of continued employment, 10 shows a week, 90 minutes a show, no intermission. What's my choice? And he thought, well, this is the moment. I'm going to try again to get back into music. And he did, and found that in maybe a smaller market like Minneapolis, he could make a decent living as a musician if he was willing to cobble a lot of things together. So over the years, he's done shows like that. He's been a wedding band musician. He's been a church musician, even though he's not personally religious.
I love that.
I recently saw him perform at a John Denver tribute show, and it was amazing. It brought tears to my eyes to see him not only, make beautiful music, but also kind of redefine what success means, because we were fed a really narrow definition of success at Northwestern University. And he found a different way to, decide, I'd always wanted to be a musician. I am a musician.
Oh my God. And I love the idea of defining what success is. And if that success has been defined for us from a society or a community or our parents or whoever, versus that success that we determine for ourselves, what that means for us. And I think they're not always different, but sometimes they can be, and they can be very different by degrees of magnitude. And I think it's wonderful that you bring up that story. I want to just go. Go ahead.
If I could just jump in for a moment, I think that we need to listen to our own conceptions of what really is success for us, but we also need to listen closely to those important voices in our lives, the voices of the people who know us the best. So I'm thinking back to our 9/11 research. I haven't really talked much about careers, but we did find a few portraits among those thousands that we studied, in which there was a woman who made managing director in a Wall Street firm or something like that. And those were often stories of not just sort of climbing the ladder for the sake of climbing the ladder, which is success in Wall Street, but actually showing that a woman could make it in a man's world, and sort of inspiring her children to aspire to their own kinds of success. Or there was a firefighter who was very proud of being a Black firefighter in a mostly white Irish fire department of New York.
Yeah.
Again, just sort of inspiring other people and listening to what our close relations really think of as what really matters in a good definition of success.
Well, and along those lines, you write about your grandfather's story with tremendous transparency about his failed attempts at business and the tremendous journey from China to Brazil to the United States. But he certainly he was good at redefining what successful looked like in his own life, because it had much more to do about the integrity of the way his children grew up rather than some kind of financial reward, even though it sounded like he works very, very hard to achieve some kind of financial success. I guess what I'm curious about, Christopher, is how did those stories impact you?
Thank you for bringing up my grandfather. And when you say that we write about him with tremendous transparency, I cringe a little bit, because my aunts and uncles have copies of this book now. They live in Brazil and the United States, and I think some of them might not appreciate the full transparency because they've always referred to our family story as the Wong saga and sort of as a success story. But I think most stories worth telling are much more complicated than that. And his story involved success and failure. And I do want to say, it's written with love and admiration.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that he actually redefined success as much as maybe those around him redefined success for him. I think that he always felt in some way like a failure. So just quickly, his story is that he was born a peasant. He rose to the rank of general in the Chinese Nationalist Army, and then the Nationalists lost in the Communist Revolution to the Communist Army, and the Nationalists were driven from China. And rather than go to Taiwan, which is what most of the nationalist officials did, he moved his family to Brazil because it was at a safe distance from China and a place to start over. And he never easily made money again. I mean, he tried and failed several times as a businessman to support his family in Brazil. And, finally, whatever they were able to take with them from China kind of ran out. And fortunately, by that time, my oldest uncle was on his way to becoming a medical doctor. And he and the rest of my mom's siblings were able to support their parents for the rest of their lives. And so I think in that sense, being supported, from a fairly young age, he was, probably late 50s, 60 by the time he truly retired from trying to make a living for himself. And he lived until, I think, 96. So being supported in that way was, in some sense, for him, a little bit shameful.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what I regard as a great success is that not only did he rise from very, very modest beginnings, but he led his family on a journey of survival and then led 8 children to succeed in their own ways in their lives and careers. And those children had families, including me, whose lives would not be possible without his success and sacrifices. And, he instilled all of us with an education ethic and a work ethic that I think he wasn't able to demonstrate himself in his later years, but that he, in my mind, was his most important work. Talk about work in the home being the most important thing. And I think that was his greatest achievement, was raising this family. He also dabbled in calligraphy. He more than dabbled in calligraphy. Calligraphy was one of the sort of 3 traditional arts of the educated Chinese person. And he copied the same Confucian passage over and over and over again on silk or rice paper, whatever he happened to be writing on. And, this Confucian passage that teaches us about sort of the harmonious society is hanging on the walls of all of our homes as sort of a tribute to what he taught us and to his legacy.
Yeah.
That is so cool. Again, that part of the book that you start the book with it, you come back to the story later. And I just think that it's just really, really great that you wrote about it with such love and compassion. So just bravo to you and Jen for including it in the book. We always have to just talk a little bit more about your particular musical proclivities. And so we've got a question that we've been posing to several of our guests for the past couple of years. And it's about being stranded on a desert island with 2 musical artists, right? So you've if you've listened, we asked this question, but let's say you're stranded for a year, and if you get to take two musicians' catalogs with you, and you have to decide today, which 2 musicians' catalogs would you take with you?
I have thought about this because I anticipated it. And I couldn't come up with a good answer without cheating. So I'm going to cheat.
No cheating.
No
cheating is perfectly allowed. There we go. I would cheat on this one too.
Well, because if I didn't cheat, then, I'm sort of torn between. Before we started recording, we were talking about how, Jen takes credit for most of the pop culture references in the book, and I take credit for am kind of made fun of for most of the snooty references. And if I chose like 2 classical composers, I would just sound snooty. So So
it's your year on the desert island. You get to take whoever the hell you want to take with you.
So here's how I'm cheating. I was in New York a little over a year ago, and whenever I'm in New York alone, I just look for things to do, tickets to buy to something. And Philip Glass, the minimalist classical composer, I always search his name to see if there's any performances of his works while I'm there. And I found a Philip Glass concert, and it was his annual Tibet House benefit. And I had no idea what that was, but I just saw the name Philip Glass. So I thought I was going to a Philip Glass concert. But it turns out,
to see Philip Glass, right?
I thought I was going to see at least his music performed, if not him. I wasn't sure. It was at Carnegie Hall, of course you kind of expect something big. And it was bigger than I could have imagined, but it was different than I ever imagined. So this is an annual concert, and he gets together, I don't know, around 30 different musical acts to perform on stage as part of this fundraising benefit. And he did perform on the piano himself briefly. The Philip Glass Ensemble performed maybe the weirdest and wildest piece of music I've ever seen on stage that is still like resonating in my brain, an excerpt from his opera Einstein on the Beach. But then in between all that, there were musicians from all different genres, most of whom I'm not cool enough to have heard of, who are now on my playlist because it was just so amazing. So the one I had heard of was Bernard Sumner, the lead singer of New Order, which I really liked in college, singing like an acoustic version of Bizarre Love Triangle. And that was bizarre in itself. But he was also like wearing a sport coat and tennis shoes and just looked like such a dad. Like he was the biggest geek on stage, but then
he always looked kind of like, he never had the rock star kind of look, but still that paints a really good picture there.
Yeah, it was like practically nerdy, but then these other musicians, the ones that I remember the most, Arouge Aftab, Alison Russell, Boy Genius, which like I didn't realize at the time my daughter listens to.
My daughter listens to Boy Genius too. That's the only reason I know
Bordello.
that.
Like if I could take just like 2 recordings of Tibet House benefit concerts to that desert island, that would be enough for me.
Okay.
That.
All right. We'll take that cheat.
I think that's a fantastic way of doing this. It's like we've talked about. Do you get to take, if we picked somebody, Paul McCartney, right? You get all the Beatles works, all the other work, and then all those collaborations with everybody,
cheat.
right? So that works because it's not just those kind of things. I think this is it's a legitimate cheat. I like it. So there you go.
I think you're more permissive about that, Kurt, than Tim is. Tim's still thinking, are we going to allow this?
I am very much more permissive of the, how we answer this question. So
I'm reluctant, but I'll accept it.
Thank you. Because my other answer was just so much more boring.
This was great. And Christopher, we have to say, with tremendous gratitude, thank you so much for being a guest on Behavioral Grooves today. We really enjoyed our conversation.
I did too. So nice to meet you guys, and thank you for talking.
Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I share ideas on what we learned from our discussion with Christopher, have a free-flowing conversation, and groove on whatever else comes into our badly working brains.
Yeah. I loved this idea of talking to Christopher about the philosophy of work because it kind of screwed up my mind for a little bit in a good way.
Okay. I was wondering how you were going to twist that back into badly working for us. But I like that it screwed up your mind. I was thinking that our brains just work. Our brains just are badly working all the time. You and me.
They work badly. Yeah. Mine does.
You didn't get that.
Sure.
Oh my God. I thought for sure this was going to be a great, I don't know.
We're off to a good start.
Sees what happens when I think again, my badly working brain thought that you would catch it and get that joke. But no.
Come on. We've done this for 7.5 years. I think. I'm hoping that you actually get a better perspective of who I am.
Oh, all
man.
right. All right. Let's, sorry, listeners, as we go off on our diatribes. What did you take from this conversation?
The big thing for me is that work and life balance, and then thinking about, the job career calling kind of thing. It's about balance. And I feel like
Or
the
the
underlying
imbalance that people often have, right?
the imbalance. Yeah, actually, that's actually the problem. It's not a problem to be balanced, but it's hard to find balance for some people. And imbalance is a really terrible thing that happens. And so I was just really struck after sort of reflecting on Christopher's comments that imbalance is such a big problem for us.
Well, the 9/11 work, I think, really calls that out. Again,
Yeah.
in those remembrances, most people didn't talk about their work. 2/3 of them didn't even have work mentioned,
Right.
much less
Right.
having work be the main attribute of somebody's lives. And we think about how much time, energy, mind, space is used with us thinking about work. And that seems way off when at the end of our lives, is that really the meaningful part? Right?
Yeah. Well, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and trace this back as a problem that started with the Industrial Revolution. I'm not going to blame it for all of our ills, but if we think about what happened in the Industrial Revolution, that it bifurcates our life, it separates our work life from our home life. It takes all of these cottage industries and now starts to put them in factories and gets people to have to go to work, to make work a separate thing rather than something that happens at home with our families, with the people in our lives. Now, there's plenty of things to argue about the troubles of getting 8-year-olds behind the tractor, on the farm, because that's not always safe
And
for
working,
anybody.
18-hour days on a farm,
7 days a week.
Yeah.
Right. But I do believe that there was sort of more harmony and symmetry and balance. If you worked 18 hours a day on a farm, it was more likely that you would take a break for meals. You would find ways. You're always with your family. You're always with them. There's some flow that happens in a positive way that got disconnected with the Industrial Revolution.
You mentioned earlier that I should know you after 7.5 years. I think I should have anticipated you going to the Industrial Revolution on this. It's your go-to on
it's
all
kind
this
of my
kind
big
of stuff.
bugaboo. I know.
Yeah, I know, but it's great. I love it. I love it. I think I think there's probably some validity in what you're talking about, right? This idea of this separation, this bifurcation, as you talked about, and moving it away. But I also think that it's just the way that we think about work and the way that our social norms talk about work. And we have this societal expectation, particularly in the United States. And I know this isn't always around the world, but what is the first thing that we ask or we tell when somebody is new to us? Like, what do you do? It is about your work. And yet in the big scheme of things, we misappropriate that. That's interesting.
Why is that so defining? Why does what do you do for your work have to be like one of the first questions that comes out of our mouth?
I don't know. Well, you have the research from Columbia about it's not the same, but you want to talk about that?
Yeah, Ron Kivitz did this wonderful work a bunch of years ago when he interviewed Columbia University graduates, and in this set of responses, he had people who had just recently graduated, to people who were 5 years graduated, to 10 years, and there was even some 50-year alums who were participated in this particular survey. And one of the key questions was, to what degree do you first of all, did you use your spring break time to stay at school and study, or did you decide to go and party and have fun and,
Go
do
down
whatever?
to South Padre and have some margaritas on the beach.
Whatever. I don't know if they did that 50 years ago, but right. So first of all, just tell the researchers what you did, and then to what degree do you regret doing what you did, making the choice that you made? And the recent college grads, the 1 to 5 years out, had a much higher level of regret around going and partying. They regretted going to party. And then the further away from graduation that you got, the greater the regret changed and became more to emphasize, I regret not going to party. I regret staying back at school and studying. Yeah. And so there's this tremendous shift in the way people responded and the way that they framed their lives. And I can't help but thinking that there's more wisdom in the 50-year grads who said, if I stayed back on spring break and studied, that was a waste of time. I would have done okay on that class anyway. I didn't need to stay back. I could have gone and had fun with my friends.
Yeah, and that I think is really interesting, and particularly as it relates to this, there's a temporal component about it, which goes to, as we were talking about, maybe this overemphasis on work because it's temporal, right? This idea that it is immediately in front of us. It is like the homework over spring break versus the going some vacation on spring break. The family time is that vacation, and the overwork is the studying. And I think there's some real truth to that. And it reminds me, and we've talked about this just recently, is there's Matthew Dix is a storyteller, and he did this thing, and he tells this story, like a long story, but basically at the end, he talks about, I make decisions now as if I was my 100-year-old self. Now, I don't use 100-year-old self, but I've started to use this because I think I might be dead at 100, so then I wouldn't have really good decisions. But my mother
so your
lived to
100-year-old self would just be dust.
I'd be dead, so then I can't make any decisions. So, but my mother lived to be 89, and I think I might be able to outlast her by a year. So I'm using my 90-year-old self as this way to think about the decisions I'm making. So if my 90-year-old self, I put the decision, do I work over the weekend, or do I go instead and play golf with my friends? What is going to be more valuable to that 90-year-old Kurt? And I think it's a really powerful way of getting us to think about the decisions we make that take them out of that temporal. As you said, it's that 50-year anniversary, the alumni who's saying, damn, you should have gone on the frickin' spring break.
Right.
I mean, come on.
Right.
You would have got it. So what if you got, instead of an A, you got an A- or an A- to a B+. It doesn't matter in the big scheme of life. And that's the important thing, I think. And again, the 9/11 remembrances kind of brought that home, I think, at least for me, from the conversation with Christopher.
Yeah, they did. It also kind of gets to, if you are the kind of person who has moved from job to career and are in that category of calling, like, I have to do this, I'm compelled, I'm addicted. That's my word. That's not the author's word. But if you're in that category, then maybe you just need to do that.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, but it's the Gauguin.
There could be some negative consequences to it, but
right. But it's that Gauguin story, right? Did I pronounce that name right?
Good enough, Gauguin. Yeah,
good enough for you, Kurt. Okay, but this idea of just running off to a desert island and painting and disregarding your family and all of those, there is a cost to that. And now Gauguin became world famous and his art is fantastic.
Yeah.
But how many people have a calling where they will never have that success? And maybe that's not the reason. If you're in a calling, it isn't necessarily for the for the world recognition or whatever else it is going for, maybe that's okay, but there's a cost. And so if you're okay with that cost, it's hard. It's a big philosophical question for me.
It really is. And, we've talked about this in the past. I remember you bringing up this point in the conversation, like, what would the world be without Gauguin's work?
Yeah.
Like, would the world be worse off? Like, would just the art world be shit because we didn't have Gauguin? I don't think so.
Or
I think it would be okay.
Or could he have done that work without, having to
giving up his family and
go and be such a asshole, basically.
Yeah.
And I don't know, right?
Yeah.
There is something about that. If you look like a Steve Jobs who, did all of that work, any of those industrial barons who have set the world on fire with their newest technology, only to have it be replaced in 30, 50 years. Or you know what? I mean, there were other computer makers besides Apple, right? There were other MP3 players besides Apple. Did they change the way that we think about things? Yes. Did that impact people in a positive manner? For many people, yes. Would that not have occurred if Apple wasn't there? I don't know. Right?
Yeah.
And it would have just been somebody else with a different calling. And so instead of Apple, we would have had, the Orange Computing Company or whoever it was, Dell, right? I mean, remember Dell?
Right.
There you go.
Right.
Could have had cows all over instead of apples. There you go.
That was Gateway. I think the cows were Gateway computer.
You're right. It was Gateway.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I want to loop all this back to the balance and imbalance part of the story on an individual level, because I think that we talk about finding your groove as being something that does represent more about balance than imbalance. That personal responsibility matters, right?
Yes.
If you have a family and you're going to stay with them, if you have a family, period, there is some responsibility that you have toward them.
Yes.
I think that there's, I realize that family is, even as we're having this conversation, it is a construct made by human beings that we created the rules around what is and what isn't. But if you have a family, there are some, not just social norms, but some obligations that you have to provide, to contribute, to be a part of it. I don't think you can find your groove in a way that separates yourself from everything else or everybody else.
Right. And particularly if there are children involved and you have a bit of that responsibility. But you're right, because if you just ask people about your groove, many people would equate it with calling, but I don't think it is. The way that we think about your groove is not necessarily about just finding your calling. It is about living your best life. And your best life is the totality of that life. It isn't just that work aspect of it. So I think that's really important as we are moving forward with this.
Yeah, I agree. Shall we wrap it up at this point?
Yeah. So again, I think, we talked about the balance or imbalance of work, and make sure as listeners that you think about this, because too often we kind of go on autopilot and we don't think about the impact. And again, your story about the reference, take a look back from your 90-year-old self as to what's going to be really important, and maybe make some shifts in your life around that.
I also like the 90-year-old self recommendation, and just to think about, just to take stock of your life and say, where am I balanced and where am I imbalanced?
Mm-hmm.
Just give some consideration to what are the things in my life that really are kind of pulling me out of sync and pulling me out of my groove.
And with that, listeners, we hope that this conversation has led you to have a more balanced life, where this week you can go out and find your groove.